What was it that made the 39th Battalion such a great battalion?
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 105 of the Principles of War podcast, Ralph Honner and the 39th Battalion on the Kokoda track. This is the second part of a two-part interview with Dr. David Cameron, an expert on the Kokoda Campaign. He's written many books on it. He is sharing with us his expertise on the 39th Battalion, what made the 39th Battalion great, and their leader during the Kokoda Campaign, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honner. Let's get right back into the interview. What was Ralph Honner like? What was his sort of background? What was it that made him...
He's a very religious man. He was a disciplinarian, but he's also, he could stretch the rules. The men worshipped him. A lot of people say that about the doctors, but they certainly didn't have much respect or time for Cameron. But it shows, he really set up the spirit because the battalion. Famous story of the guys a few days after the Battle of Histology broke up, and you got the 214th, 216th arrived. 214th goes to support the 39th Battalion, and Keyes is after Keyes, his commanding 214th says to Honner, "Look, you can pull your guys out now. We'll hold the position." And Honner says, "You need us here," because by then Brigadier Potts is there, and he's telling the 39th to withdraw. And Keyes and Honner get together, and they both agree they need at least two battalions there. Mind you, the 39th Battalion probably about half strength by this point. So Honner and his men decide to stay. And then not only that, it gets to a point a few days later, the guest house where you've got the wounded, the badly wounded of the 39th there, and then they hear that the fight is still going on, and the Japanese are starting to break through the perimeter. The wounded guys, all but two, one has his, if I remember correctly, has his lower jaw shot off. The other one, I think he's basically lost an arm. They stay, but everybody else, the wounded, go back to the 39th, and that's because Horner's like almost in fear watching these guys come in, and he said, "Well, why are you here?" And he said, "Well, because you didn't expect us not to be." And that shows the whole spirit of the 39th Battalion to me, that episode. Would that have happened under Cameron? I doubt it.
I think it's one of those iconic moments in Australian military history where those 18 soldiers pick up, because they were effectively waiting to be taken out of the battle, moved back to Port Moresby. The battle was over for them, probably the war was over for some of them, and yet almost everyone who could, turned around to go back to look after their mates.
And they're walking past the 53rd Battalion, guys who were sitting in the rest house who had been, I think it was C Company, who'd been ordered to carry mortar bombs up to 214. They were the first to bring up a mortar. They were sent up the line at Israel to supply the mortar bombs, and they got to Israel just beyond Israel guest house, and they were just pitching the bombs as they went along, like too heavy, and then they sat down. Meanwhile, you got the wounded and the 39th walking past them to get up to the fighting. And the guys commented on that. Again, that's not a critique of the men. That's got to do with the officers and the NCOs, not the men themselves, because they were treated appallingly. They acted that way. If your officers, your NCOs have shown you, basically saying that we're not really concerned about your welfare, then you know what the result's going to be with your men. The 39th was exactly the opposite. Again, I'm not disparaging the guys at the 53rd, but I think you can, the way the officers and NCOs treated them, is, well, you treat them that way, that's what you're going to get. And that's the difference between the 53rd and the 39th. It's the officers and the NCOs.
It's a large part of the story, I think, about how two battalions with fairly similar, there are differences in the way that they were raised, performed so differently on the track.
Yep. And also at Histology, Honner and Keyes, you had some leeway. Ward, I mean, the 53rd, you've got Brigadier breathing down your neck at a lower. So I'd hate to be a battalion commander, and then I've got the Brigadier who's probably, his headquarters is just 20 metres away. Honner and Keyes, they had some degree of, Potsy had full confidence in Honner and Keyes, but obviously didn't have much confidence in Ward and the 53rd, and he made sure he was basically breathing down their neck. So that would place you in a very difficult position being the battalion commander. But I dare say, Honner did the right thing, had to be there with the 53rd.
And I think one of the other things is, of course, having the CO killed.
Yeah.
The 2IC of the battalion was away on course, doing a course so that he could become a lieutenant colonel and take over his own battalion, part of the mobilisation process. But that meant that it was a temporary major who was going to be taking over command of the battalion.
You've got a full battle raging, you've got your battalion commander going out to try and find out where your troops are. It's not a good look. Especially you've got the brigadier saying, well, no, where's A company, where's C company, and he goes, oh, I don't know, because they haven't reported back into me. Well, you better go find them. Then Kutz goes down to the waterfall and gets killed.
Exactly. Did you want to talk about any of the other actions that the 39th was involved in around Isirava?
Well, yeah, they were there for the whole Battle of Isirava. Then they were there for Isirava Rest House, which was just as traumatic as Isirava. That's when a lot of the guys get thrown into the Eel Creek Valley and get lost. Because Keith, the commander of the 2nd 14th, he gets thrown down into the gully with a number of the 214th and 39th men. He gets captured twice by the Japanese, and he sort of disappears from history. But Benson, this is really in the 39th, but the whole thing about Isirava Rest House is, you got Keith. The thing about the Kokoda Campaign is, in the whole of the Middle East campaign, you get one battalion commander killed, and he's killed driving a landmine. Within about 3 weeks, you get 3 battalion commanders killed in Kokoda. You get Owen killed at the Kokoda Plateau, Ward is killed at the waterfall, and a couple of days later, Key is captured and he's ultimately died. Now, he's later discovered at the beachhead, or found at the beachhead by Benson, who's a delayed missionary who survived. He sees Owen, he sees Lieutenant Keyes, we think it's Lieutenant Colonel Keyes, at the beachhead because he sees an Australian Lieutenant Colonel. And then when he goes missing, it's Keyes. And he's at the Japanese beachhead at Sanananda in the hospital. And then he disappears from historical records. So, and Keyes told Benson that he escaped twice and was captured the second time. Now, whether he was executed or he died, he's in a very bad way when he was in the hospital. So maybe he died from treatment or what happened to him in the valley just after. The 39th, of course, doing a standing job again at the beachhead. Not only are they delaying action at the start of it, they're right there at the end. They're the ones who take Gona, and they're the ones who take Hattie's village. Then they're sent over to Isirava. And then the ultimate insult is then after all of that, they get broken up.
I find that to be really confusing. Why were they broken up?
To be totally honest, I think it's because they were almost an orphan battalion at that stage. I mean, the move between the 30th, originally with the 30th Brigade, then they were in the 21st, and then they're back with the 30th, and then they go back to the 21st for a short time at Gona, then they're back with the 30th at Sanananda, but then by the time they're at Sanananda, you've got the 36th, remember right, the 36th, the 49th, and the 55th, 53rd, dash 55th, 53rd, with the 30th Brigade. They're almost like an orphan battalion, but they're getting moved all over the place, and there's no way the 39th should have been broken up. It should have been an example. And also the 3rd Battalion, even though Gang Cameron is in charge of the 3rd Battalion, the 3rd Battalion has largely been ignored. They do a phenomenal job on the march over, on the offensive from Hillaborough Ridge, Innotu Ridge, all the way up to the battle for Buller Creek Village, and then at Weaving and Gory, and then they also end up at Nidana. They do a phenomenal job. So you've got 2 outstanding military battalions, the 3rd Battalion and the 39th. And the 39th gets struck off the order of battle, and I've got, maybe they're unattached to the battalion, like, well, it's like, I don't know why. It makes no sense to me. I can understand a number of other battalions being struck off, but not the 39th, not everything they did. They should have been a shining example to show the rest of the militia is what you can achieve. Be proud to be a member of the militia. Look what the 39th Battalion guys did. Look what the 3rd militia guys did. But yeah, probably to me, they're just as good as any battalion in the 2nd area. And I still think the 39th Battalion is one of the most outstanding battalions produced in the Second World War. And that's comparing it to any 2nd RAF battalion.
I wonder to what degree it was the fact that they were militia and their success. But the other component of it, I think, is that it was in the interests of many of the generals to disparage the militia, because that would mean that it was easier to put more pressure on the United States for more troops. That also applied to MacArthur. MacArthur was always trying to be as disparaging as possible of Australian troops.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the fact that it meant...
Well, that blew up in his face at the Battle of the Beachheads, where he's forced to admit when Blamey, of all people, surprised me, and he finally said something sensible, saying, and I'm paraphrasing, look, I don't need more American troops. I need Australian troops, militia. I want the militia. I want the 21st Battalion and the 39th Battalion to go in because I know they'll fight. And MacArthur has to, okay, because I think it's going to send the 41st Division. I don't want your 41st Division. I want the Australian 21st Brigade and 39th Battalion.
Exactly, and because at that point of the campaign, in fairness to the US division, the United States had made many of the same mistakes that the Australian Army had made with those militia brigades.
Oh, yeah.
The United States had made that better. There was a moderate amount of hubris in the fact that they thought that they were going to be able to, they were just naturally better soldiers, which I think there's plenty of examples to show that there's no one without preparation and leadership. It's very difficult for anyone to fight effectively.
And that's what the comparison of the 39th and the 53rd show you, exactly. And that's nonsense that Australians are born soldiers and every other nationally born soldiers. It's got to do with leadership. And people deride the Italians. Italians had some outstanding in the North African campaign. They had some outstanding units. So, yeah, it's not that Australians are naturally born better. No, because you've got to also remember that the guys that were fighting, especially the Americans that were fighting the beachhead, they were militia as well. They were American militia. They were the, what do you call them, the American version of militia. They weren't full-time GIs. They were part-time soldiers originally. I'm trying to remember the actual wording for the American version of militia.
National Guard?
National Guard, yeah. So they were basically the same as the militia. They weren't well trained. They were almost the same situation as the Americans. Good. They were in there. Mind you, the 53rd didn't go in there being loudmouth and boastful. They just didn't care. Whereas the Americans were over boastful and underqualified, underexperienced. That's not their fault, but I mean, yeah. Bruno and Santa, but oh well, you know, you can get this word here, and you know what the results there were.
Exactly. So, is there anything else that you wanted to say about the 39th Battalion? Obviously, and I think probably one of the most famous battalions in Australian military history, based on incredible performance across Kokoda and the Battle of the Beaches.
I think the performance at the beachhead is just as equally outstanding as Kokoda, as the Kokoda campaign. Gona and Sanananda, well, what they did was phenomenal.
Particularly in quite poorly, there was still that imperative for offensive action coming from MacArthur.
Yep.
For confusing reasons, really.
This is that the beachhead probably worse than Kokoda. If you, Owen Stanley, you don't have to worry about malaria because it's so high, and you've got problems with supply. But you're fighting Gona, you're fighting in kunai grass in the heat, and then you've got swamps all around you. And then, you've got malaria, you've got the conditions at Gona, especially Sanananda was the place they call it a bastion of the place, Peter Broon's famous book. It was probably the worst place you'd ever, anywhere along the Kokoda or the beachheads. You combine both of those campaigns into one. I would say Sanananda was the worst place you could ever want to be. Out of all of those, from July to January, the last place I'd want to be is Sanananda.
And yet, and they performed across all of that. So in combat for a long time. And I think I read somewhere that in a tropical area like Port Moresby, you could keep a battalion there for around 6 months. After that, they were culminated. They were in Port Moresby for 6 months before they did the Kokoda campaign. Then they did the Battle of the Beaches.
Yep. And they only had what they left. They got out just after Sarava. So it was early September, they were sent back to Port Moresby. And then in November, they started to head back north of the beachhead. And they've hardly had time to reorganise, regroup, and reinforce. And a lot of the reinforcements, of course, were guys that were sick and wounded from the 39th. So they went back into the battle and they were nowhere near full strength. And most of the reinforcements from the 39th were guys that had suffered during the initial campaign of the Kokoda. Usually joined the unit after recovering from their illness and their wounds. And then they found themselves a few months later, in some cases, weeks later after they got out of hospital, going on Sanananda. And you've got to think, it's going on Sanananda. It's not only that the 39th pull at Gona, they took Gona. They've been fighting for Gona for almost a month. Now, and the bad thing about the beachhead, this is where Honner is outstanding, is everybody's in a hurry, everybody's in a rush. I'm talking about the Allies, the Australians and Americans, and because of the parade where Bladney calls them rabbits, I'm like, what's the difference between the run, rabbit, run speech? a lot of the guys who were there from the 21st, a lot of the officers that were there, and the men who were at that appalling speech by Blaney, they got to the beachhead and they basically said, "We'll show you, Blaney." A lot of those guys got killed trying to, because they felt shame. They shouldn't have been, but they wanted to show Blaney, "We'll show you." And you had officers there who were trying to prove themselves to a war like Blaney of all people. They went in and they were doing really. The planning was pretty bad at Kona. They were sending guys in, almost like the First World War, very little reconnaissance, to try and capture the beachhead, try and show Blaney that we're not cowards. Wasn't the only reason, but there was a lot of rushing. Blaney and MacArthur are in a hurry. These guys don't want to, they're trying to live down the run, rabbit, run speech. And we're not taking this sense in Peter Boone, he knows more about it than I do. And he agrees that it's basically that run, rabbit, run speech, which a lot of guys were killed at Gona trying to make good for the Blaney speech. And so it wasn't only that, it was also because Blaney and MacArthur was demanding, "You've got to get the beachhead, you've got to get the beachhead, you've got to get it now, you've got to get it now." Kept saying all Japanese reinforcements coming this way and the other. But a lot of good men died trying to live down that run, rabbit, run speech by Blaney. Honner, he refused, at one point, he refused to take Gona, I think it was on the 7th, he said, "No, I'll take it on the 8th. And anyone else would have been sacked. And a number of the officers, like the 2nd 27th Cooper and also Albert Caro from the 216th, they were sacked. They were considered too soft, defending their men at Gona. Luckily, Honner, he did the same thing. He said, I'm not sending the guys in today. I'll send them in tomorrow after we had reconnaissance and we've got artillery laid down." And he didn't get sacked. And he went in the next day and he took it. Not only did they take Gona that day, within a week, there was large Japanese reinforcements landing to the west. Honner and his men went to the west across Kookoda River towards and then River and Kookoda River at Hattie's Village. They retook Hattie's Village and he released the Japanese flanking force that was there largely. Then they finally get back to Gona after all that, and then they said, "Oh, by the way, 21st Brigade, they will be sent back to Port Moresby, what's left of them." In some cases, you got less than 100 men in the battalion. 39th Battalion, they get sent over to San Fernando, and there's probably about 150 of them. Now, when you walk out of San Fernando, 27 men are left. At the time they walk out of San Fernando, 27 men out of 39th Battalion are left, officers and men.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Yep. Some say it's 39. It's not 29 men. It's not 39 men. Some say, 39 men by nature. It's 27 men with the 28. 27 or 28 men walk out of San Fernando to catch the plane back to Port Moresby.
Now, one question, when they were back in Port Moresby before the Battle of the Beaches, they received some of their reinforcements actually came from the
53rd.
Yes.
And they did very well. They did very well. That showed that they did just as well as the other guys could not. It's just the leadership. If you treat men with, as you know, your military experience, you treat men with respect, and you've got to be a leader. Go react to that. But the same men who probably were, didn't do much when a member of the 53rd, that's 55th, 53rd, or the 53rd Battalion. They did just as well as the other guys who were members of the 39th. When they joined the 39th, they performed just as well as the other guys did. But that's the way they were treated. And there was the spirit of corps there. The 39th, people knew, if you remember the 39th, the guys on the ground knew, they respected the guys in the 39th. But towards the end of Isarava, you've got the 39th Battalion holding Iora Creek, which is the next fallback position. After they leave Isarava, then they fall back to Wallowa, and then they fall back to Iora Creek, because they're going to hold it at Mayora, but they end up holding it Mission Ridge, Butcher's Hill. But one thing that everyone talked about was at the Iora Creek, the 39th Battalion held what the guys the second left pulled back through them. And the 39th really were accepted, you've got guys from the second AIF relying on them to hold the Japanese while they fall back. And so the 14th, the 216th fall back to the southern side of Iora Creek, where you got the 39th Battalion up the front stopping the Japanese. You wouldn't have, a lot of the AIF guys would have found that insulted the Jocko, but they knew the 39th would hold.
There was actually one of the companies was doing a similar role at Isarava. So there was definitely some of the companies were of very questionable quality in the 53rd, but some of them had actually fought relatively well. But this driving dominant narrative about the fact that they were unable to fight, which fed into the political imperative of trying to get as many troops as possible, meant that story that never really got out.
Yeah, it certainly got out with the 39th, and that's why to this day I still don't know whether 39th did disband. Whether on the Orphan Battalion, the 39th Battalion was, but military battalions disband. That's the last one you would disband. That is the one you should hold up as this is what the militia can do. And what you're saying may very well be the case. Maybe they did too well.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've really highlighted the small differences that make a huge impact on combat capability when battalion is raised, because there are a lot of similarities between the 39th and the 53rd. It's those differences that have fed into the vast difference between their performances.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yes, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, James. I very much appreciate it.
So, thank you very much to David for sharing his expertise on the Kookoda Campaign and the 39th Battalion. For me, there's a couple of instances which really demonstrate the strong morale within the battalion and how it enabled their performance. Brigadier Potts, when he took command of Maroubra Force, saw the state of the soldiers in the 39th Battalion, and he ordered them withdrawn because he needed to get the fresh 2nd, 14th and 2nd, 16th Battalions up, and it was going to be difficult to sustain them. However, Honner realised that if they were to hold the Japanese at Ishirava, the 2nd, 14th and 2nd, 16th were going to need all of the help that they could get. Despite being in a terrible state, despite having culminated, the 39th would stay and support the two new 2nd AIF battalions in the defence of Ishirava. On the 27th of August, 3/5 of the fighting power of the battalion was missing. 2 platoons under Lieutenant Sword had been cut off, and there was a missing platoon under Lieutenant Pentland. Without communications, without supplies, and running low on ammunition, these 3 platoons, rather than surrendering, rather than shattering, these 3 platoons managed to marry up behind enemy lines and evade the Japanese for the next 2 days before returning to friendly lines. Honner would later write, "Unprepared for such an apparition, I was surprised to see a grimy, bearded figure leading in a tattered line at twilight. I did not recognise him until he saluted and announced, 'Sword, sir,' reporting in from patrol. There was more than mere formality in my answering salute. Pentland and his gaunt gang were with him too. Despite all they'd been through, those men promptly returned back to the fighting because the situation was dire. Honner had put out a call for all possible reinforcements." The sick and wounded of the 39th Battalion were stationed at Ishirava Rest House, just behind Ishirava. These men were due to be evacuated back down the trail. Lieutenant Stuart Johnson asked for volunteers from the fittest of the unfit at the aid station. Honner, as desperate as he was, wasn't expecting the sick and wounded to answer the call, but they did. Private Jeff Burton of B Company, who was 18 at the time, recalled, "The battalion was in trouble. 27 out of 30 went back. The 3 who stayed were miners afoot, a bullet in the throat, and a forearm blown off. We never did it for God, king, or country. Forget that. We did it because the 39th Battalion expected it of us, and we never stopped trying for the battalion's sake until relieved." Honner would later recall, when they learned of the desperate plight of their comrades they had left at Ishirava, they spontaneously renounced the promise of heaven ahead to plod back into the perils of hell. I can think of no incident that reflected more radiantly the great esprit de corps, the strong bond of mateship in the battalion. He later wrote how a corporal of the 2nd 16th told me afterwards, "It was enough to make a man weep to see those poor skinny bastards hobble in on their bleeding feet." Honner wrote, "Then came Johnston and the last stumbling reinforcement of the stout-hearted sick from the hospital, yet worthy of Valhalla. Key had a reserve again." He's referring there to Lieutenant Colonel Albert Key, the commanding officer of the 2nd 14th Battalion. Do have a look at the show notes. I'm going to put a table up that compares some of the key factors that were the same and were different, not only between the 39th Battalion and the 53rd Battalion, but I'm also going to look at Delta Company 6RAR. You'll remember them from the Battle of Long Tan. The OC of the company at the time, Major Harry Smith, had prepared the company extremely well for combat. And I think it's worthwhile noting some of the differences there. The situation with which both of the battalions found themselves in was dictated by a series of strategic issues and operational issues. And we're going to go through those because it's important to avoid those issues wherever possible. However, if you need to force generate a battalion for combat extremely quickly, it would be worthwhile remembering these factors that led to the performance that the 39th Battalion was able to exhibit on the Kokoda track. Firstly, we look at the formation. The 53rd Battalion formed November 1941. They were formed for service in Darwin. Not something that a lot of people wanted to volunteer for back in those days. It was seen as a backwater and not likely to see any action. The 39th Battalion formed just 1 month earlier in October. They were formed with the express purpose of serving in New Guinea. The manner in which the battalions was formed was very different. As we know, the 53rd Battalion had about 60 soldiers from a range of battalions, and the battalions had seen that as an opportunity to get rid of some of their dead wood. The 39th Battalion was formed from elements of the 3rd and 4th Infantry Divisions and the 2nd Cavalry Division. They had to volunteer and they were selected. They were interviewed to see if they were suitable for going into the battalion. The initial composition of the 53rd Battalion was complicated when they had the large number of AWOLs on Christmas Day, 1941, and over 100 troops were shanghaied from the General Duties Depot. These troops were very surprised to find themselves the next day on the Aquitania heading to Port Moresby. As David mentioned, leadership was a very big factor in the difference between the two battalions. Now, I'm not saying that Lieutenant Colonel Ward was a bad leader. I think that he was very brave, and I think he'd done as best he could do to prepare the battalion, particularly given what he had as resources. There were some significant issues within the 53rd Battalion. The command team lacked depth, so we know that they didn't have a strong RSM. We know that the company commanders were also inexperienced. His 2IC during the battle was away in Australia on a promotion course so that he himself could be a lieutenant colonel. Almost all of the majors and all of the captains were holding temporary ranks. We've seen how the lieutenants and sergeants weren't particularly well prepared for the jobs that they would be doing. Extremely important jobs. Lieutenant Rolly Hogan had only done a 9-week promotion course to get him to lieutenant, and we've seen how the sergeants had been picked from corporals who'd been able to lay out their kit neatly. That's probably not a great way of selecting who your sergeants are, and it's critical to remember that a sergeant is the product not only of their character but also of their experience and knowledge. Sergeant Bill Elliott, who was one of the original sergeants in the battalion, wrote of the officers, "They were all just thrown in a heap and they were trying to sort themselves out." Compare and contrast with the 39th Battalion. We've got Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Conran. He had been a member of the 1st AIF. He was 52 years old, which isn't that old, but he would struggle with the arduous conditions on the Kokoda track. All of them had volunteered. There was many older officers because Conran was looking for experience from the 1st AIF. 11 of the warrant officers and sergeants and a private were veterans. They instilled pride and esprit de corps within the battalion. One of the lieutenants, Keith Lovett, had accepted a demotion from captain to be able to serve in the 39th. So we can see that the 39th Battalion has got a solid foundation from which to build on. This is only part of the story as far as the leadership within the battalions goes, because Brigadier Porter had seen how poor the strategic situation was. He could see the writing on the wall, and he had requested a reinforcement of experienced 2nd AIF officers, and these arrived on the 21st of June. 36 officers arrived in total. 16 were posted to the 39th Battalion. They received 1 lieutenant colonel, 1 major, 6 captains, and 8 lieutenants. That lieutenant colonel was Lieutenant Colonel Owen, and he would replace Conran. Conran was struggling with the arduous conditions of the Kokoda track and the tropical environment. The 49th Battalion received 12 and just 8 went to the 53rd Battalion. They were 2 captains and 6 lieutenants. We're not really sure how the number of officers was divvied up. It may have been vacancies within the battalions, or it may have been how many each of the COs requested. 3 of the captains who were posted to the 39th Battalion were given company commands. The other 2 company commanders were Merritt and Templeton. This meant that in all of the companies of the 39th Battalion, there was either a competent officer in command or there was an experienced 2nd AIF officer. Lieutenant Hugh Dolby was one of the officers who posted in. He'd come from the 2nd 27th Battalion. He was interviewed by Peter Brune, who asked him about the resentment that was felt towards the new 2nd AIF officers who came in. And he said, "Of course it was so. All you ever had to do was put yourself in the other fellow's situation. Number one, we monitored their correspondence. So one of the words I was cutting out mostly was AIF. In other words, we've got some new AIF officers. They're bastards. I left their bastards in. I can take this a step further. When we went there, these men were unshaven, they wore dirty clothes, they were hangdog, if you like. We started in on training. They had to get rifle drill, rifle practice, but after a few weeks, they started to feel like soldiers. They became good troops. Many of the officers and soldiers talked about this intense period of training before they went up the Kokoda Trail. Whilst it was short and sharp, it would pay rich dividends once they got into the jungle. Both battalions had the same equipment. They left their mortars and they left their Vickers machine guns behind. This was a big mistake in my opinion, and we're going to talk about the impact of that on the ability to generate a combined arms effect. The reason for this predominantly was logistics, but it's too easy to blame the logistics capability on the inability to generate combined arms. We will delve deeper into this in a future episode. The next factor is morale, and we see here that a strong, solid foundation with the 39th Battalion has been undermined in the 53rd by those men who, quite rightly, feel that they've been hard done by when they were shanghaied so soon in their army career. That initial morale of the battalions would be tested when they got to Port Moresby. There was the arduous work that they would be doing. There were conditions with which they were living, including people dying from dysentery and the mosquitoes, as well as bombing raids from the Japanese. Bombing raids with which the Australians were unable to respond to in any meaningful way. As we've seen, between the battalions, there was very little time for training. Neither of the battalions got any experience whatsoever in patrolling in the jungle, which is something that would be fundamental to the work that they would be doing once they got on the Kokoda Trail. The 53rd Battalion was much less experienced with using their weapons, those basic soldier skills that would be so important when they were fighting the Japanese. That crash training program that the officers from the 2nd AIF instigated for the 39th Battalion would pay rich dividends once the battalion was in contact. You're much less likely to be victorious on the battlefield when your troops are struggling with those individual soldier skills such as weapon handling, let alone those more advanced collective skills such as patrolling as a section or a platoon. One other component of the differences between the battalions was that the first contacts for the 39th Battalion were far on the other side of the Owen Stanley Ranges. This meant that it was away from the prying eyes of Maroubra Force headquarters. Companies that didn't perform well were given a second chance by Lieutenant Colonel Honner once he took over. Compare and contrast that with the 53rd Battalion, where battalion headquarters and Maroubra Force headquarters were almost co-located, and some reports from platoons and companies were going firstly to brigade headquarters and then to battalion headquarters. That's never an ideal situation. There was no joint support and there was minimal logistic support for both battalions. So when we break it down, both battalions were raised quickly. Both battalions were employed in arduous conditions, doing defensive work and working on the docks for a significant amount of time. There was minimal time for training during the majority of the time. The key differences are in the formation of the battalions, with the 39th taking people who had volunteered for duty overseas. The initial composition of the 39th was significantly more varied, with more 1st AIF experience. These were people who knew how soldiers were meant to act and what they were meant to know. The 2nd AIF reinforcements into those key company commander positions made a big difference, as did the crash training program that looked to lift the morale of the 39th Battalion and the individual soldier skills just before they set off up the Kokoda track. These were the things that made the difference, as well as the inspiring leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honner. These are the components that had a positive impact on the combat performance of the 39th Battalion, and these are the things that we need to be thinking about should we ever need to rapidly raise infantry battalions in the future. However, what we want to look at now is how things were so bad at the operational and strategic level, because the trick will be to avoid having to rapidly mobilise infantry battalions and expecting so much of them in such arduous conditions. So the next episode in this series looking at the Kookoda Campaign will look at the operational challenges faced by Basil Morris and Sid Rao when they were in command of Maroubra Force.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.